Morning, guys. Yeah, obviously just wanting to talk about Bryobia mites. Just want to keep it fairly high level, fairly short, just give you a little bit of information, just stress the importance of identification of this mite and some of the challenges that we have around that. Perhaps spend a little bit more time thinking about some recent research that we've done on this mite in terms of how it responds to chemicals and I guess what that might mean from a management perspective. And I guess outline a few management options that are available. So I guess just the first point I really want to make, and many of you will be familiar with Bryobia mites, so I guess just a very quick refresh. Obviously we have a very wide variety of mites that attack broadacre crops and pastures in Victoria. Bryobia mite is just one of those. Obviously it's very easily confused with many of these other establishing mites like red-legged earth mites, Bryobia mites, particularly very easy to, I guess, misdiagnose with the brown wheat mite in cereals. So I guess really it is very important to make sure that we do have the ID correct first and foremost, because as I'll touch on a little bit later, that does certainly impact on, I guess, how different management strategies may or may not work for us. The other, I guess, complication that we have with Bryobia mites is that there are a very large number of species. There's more than 100 species within Australia. We have probably in excess of 10 species that attack broadacre crops and pastures in the southern region. We've identified at least 7, but there's probably many more than that. So it is a bit of a complex group of mites that we really are dealing with, and I guess that is something to keep in mind. But certainly make sure we get our IDs correct. If you're having some challenges, or if you want to flick a photo or some samples just to be confident, obviously feel free to do that. The other thing, I guess, that can be quite useful when thinking about identifying Bryobia mites is not just what the mites look like. They are one of the smallest of the mites that we see, but also, I guess, the damage they cause can be quite distinctive. Unlike species like red-legged earth mites, which you'll know tend to feed in large groups, the Bryobia mite tend to feed on their own. And obviously the damage they cause is also a little bit distinctive. So in this photo that you can see here on the slide, which is vetch, you can see these quite distinctive feeding trails. And this is where the mites will basically suck out, I guess, the plant cell contents. And they typically feed in such a way that it leaves these quite distinctive feeding trails. Now, none of the other mites that I mentioned before, blue oak mites, Bryobia mites, red-legged earth mites, cause that damage. We have done some very recent work with GRDC. This is work that we did last year, just trying to really unpack and understand how Bryobia mites respond to chemicals, given that we have had quite a lot of chemical control failures reported to us over the years, particularly in Victoria and South Australia. So last year we collected a number of populations from a number of states, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and WA. I just want to present a little bit of that data today because I think the story is somewhat interesting, and as I said, I think it impacts on how we might think about managing Bryobia mites going forwards with chemicals. So this is some data of a subset of populations from New South Wales and Victoria. Basically what we did is we brought these populations into the lab here in Melbourne, and we basically looked at how each of these populations respond to a few different chemicals that are currently used in controlling Bryobia mites in the field. So this is the first, I guess, graph that I wanted to show you. So this is a product called Telstar. You'd be all very familiar. It's obviously a very effective miticide, used quite a bit to control a range of mites, including Bryobia. Basically, we've got mortality on this axis, so 100% is where all the mites are dead. And on this axis, we've got an increasing concentration of the pesticide, so Telstar. And here, as I said, I'm just showing a subset of populations. So this is 5 different populations collected at different areas in New South Wales and Victoria. And this is how they responded to Telstar. So you do see some variation between the different populations when we look at Telstar, but the variation is not particularly significant. So they jump around a little bit, but the discrepancies aren't particularly large. So if we look at a measure which is called an LC50 value, basically it's just a way that we can statistically test whether these populations are different or not. we see about a threefold difference in these 5 populations. So some differences do exist. But the story is much more complicated and perhaps surprising when we look at LEMAT, so omethylate. So the same sort of data here, exactly the same populations, but you can see a very different, pattern emerging. We see quite large differences in terms of these populations. And in fact, when we look at the LC50 values, we get some populations that are expressing a more than 40-fold increase in tolerance to LEMAT than other populations. So, quite interesting and certainly quite informative when we think about management. We know that there are at least 7 different species of Bryobia mites that attack broadacre crops and pastures. I suspect that number's actually higher. As I said, I think it'd be probably well above 10. We don't know definitively, but it's probably very likely that this data does represent different species of Bryobia mites. So this is not necessarily, I don't believe, different populations starting to evolve resistance. I don't think that's the case here. I think what's really underlying these patterns is different species of Bryobia mites. The challenge is that we can't identify these mites in the field, so we don't know when we see Bryobia mites how they're going to respond to, for example, a LEMAT application. Are they going to be more like Monangatang, or are they going to be more at the other extreme, which are a little bit more susceptible to control? So this is some data that we did, as I said, last year through funding with GRDC. Quite, I think, interesting. So what, I guess, are the options in terms of Bryobia mites from a management perspective? Look, pre-season weed control is a pretty good option for Bryobia mites. As I mentioned, they don't have this very distinctive diapause period like red-legged earth mites. So Bryobia mites do have a green bridge. So they do persist from, 1 year to the next over summer on basically, weeds and volunteer, crops. So controlling things like capeweed, clovers, and even volunteer canola can be very effective if there are paddocks where Bryobia mites are, problematic, or regions where Bryobia mites tend to, pop up year in, year out. Look, the second dot point there, the second, piece of advice, of course, is pretty common knowledge. It's common sense when dealing with any mites, really, not just Bryobia mites, but you really want to avoid planting highly susceptible crops like canola if the paddock the previous year has been, something like a pasture, particularly in the case of Bryobia mites, if it's a pasture that's predominated by clovers. Because clovers are absolutely a very preferred host of Bryobia mites. One of their common names is actually the clover mite, so they can build up in very large numbers in a clover-based pasture environment. So you don't want to be going out of a clover-based pasture into a crop like canola. Even with the seed treatment, they're not particularly effective against Bryobia mites, so don't rely on seed treatments for this guy. Look, Bryobia mites do have this natural tolerance to a number of chemicals. This does mean that chemical controls can be a bit of a challenge. We do get, as I said, a number of chemical control failures reported with Bryobia mites. Now, just to be really clear, this is different to what I talked about before and that data that I showed before, where we've got this difference between Bryobia mites. So I guess what I mean here is if we look at Bryobia mites as a group, they are much tougher to kill with chemicals than something like a red-legged earth mite is, or a blue oak mite is. And then, of course, now what we're finding with this very recent data is within those Bryobia mites, there's some populations, which I suspect are some species, that are even harder to control and harder to kill again. So if we are spraying for Bryobia mites this year, make sure you absolutely go with that full registered rate. Don't cut rates. It just doesn't work with Bryobia mites. Generally, if you're sort of thinking about what options to use, we typically used to think that organophosphates provided better control. We got a lot of control failures reported with SPs. The results from agronomists and farmers feeding back to us indicated that SPs were a little bit variable. But obviously, as I've shown with that data from our very recent work last year, is that in fact, it may be that organophosphates are also potentially quite variable, which may be underpinned by different species. So it is quite complicated. So I guess there's a few bits and bobs around management for Bryobia mites this year. Obviously, if you have questions, if you encounter them, do get in touch with us. We're happy to to chat it out.
Doorstep Science. It's our way of delivering good science straight to your door.